The following program was made possible with support of these gold sponsors. Pacific Premier Bank. When it comes to your business bank, you should expect a difference, offering businesses and individuals banking solutions with personalized service. And by Riverside County's Business and Community Services, supporting the growth and expansion of business and the community in our region.
Good morning, and thank you all for joining us today at the 2020 Inland Empire Economic Forecast Conference. I'm Victor Manuel Perez, and I proudly represent the 4th District of Riverside County on the Riverside County Board of Supervisors and serve as the chair of the Riverside County Board of Supervisors for this year, 2020. And I'd like to welcome you all here today, and I'm very proud to be here as well with my UC Riverside alumni tie as a proud alumni of UC Riverside, in which I graduated back in 1995. And I also want to say thank you to the Chancellor, Mr. Timothy White, who, before he went on to Cal State University system, he's the individual that actually gave me this tie when I was in the state legislature back between 2008 and 2014. Now, this annual event, hosted by the UC Riverside School of Business Center for Economic Forecasting and Development, has become a highly anticipated gathering. And although we aren't all in the same room this year, the economic information and analysis we'll be hearing is as critical as ever. As the only research-based business school in the inland region of Southern California, UCR's School of Business is deeply committed to creating economic growth in surrounding communities. And an important part of that mission has been to establish the Center for Forecasting and to host this conference. Since its launch in 2015, the center has helped to build awareness about the Inland Empire, which they regularly point out makes up an economic area larger than Detroit, Seattle, San Diego, and Orange County, just to give some perspective. This event is dedicated to growing and supporting the region's economy by building an accurate understanding of its key strengths, challenges, and future, and by serving as a platform for voices across business, government, and the community. This morning, in line with these goals and traditions, we hope to bring you new insights about the direction the local, state, and national economies are headed in the near and long-term future. Those insights will be presented by the Center's director, Dr. Christopher Thornburg, and the Center's research manager, Dr. Tanner Osman. A theme of today is that this pandemic has been a roller coaster ride, and I agree wholeheartedly with that assessment. This year, as the chair of the Riverside County Board of Supervisors, it has been challenging, and it has been a real task of trying to balance, meaning suppressing the pandemic on one end and keeping the economy going on the other. Now, pretty early on, Riverside County became one of the earliest jurisdictions in the nation to have to tackle this global pandemic. On January 28th, we got a call that in less than 24 hours, 200 Americans from Wuhan, China, will be landing at March Air Reserve Base. We had less than a day to prepare and begin to mobilize our response to the pandemic and quarantine these individuals. A few weeks later, the Coachella Valley, my district, the 4th District, became ground zero with the first coronavirus cases in Riverside County and some of the first cases anywhere in the state of California. I want to say that although this pandemic has brought ups and downs, the County of Riverside staff and every single department has been doing good work on a consistent basis for the benefit of our residents. We worked very early on to troubleshoot a number of issues that included testing, preparing for the medical surge, coordinating with all 17 hospitals within Riverside County, securing personal protective equipment so our workforce can be protected. Utilizing the CARES Act, federal funds that were provided to Riverside County for our pandemic response, we have been able to launch a number of county programs to support our residents and address a range of unique concerns. These programs include Riverside County Small Business Assistance Grant Program, which has provided grants of over $10,000 to over 3,460 small businesses in Riverside County and growing. Allocating $12 million in funds to bridge the digital divide when it comes to students lacking equal access to quality education because they don't have technology such as a computer or Wi-Fi connectivity. In our public schools, this has funded nearly 23,000 laptops, tablets, and over 13,000 mobile hotspots for students throughout Riverside County. Our farm workers, they are essential, and protecting our farm worker community through a unique program that provides temporary housing to quarantine apart from other family members, and wage assistance to cover lost wages. This program will help 350 farm workers with a $2,000 stipend. And as a matter of fact, that was the kicker. Not only the quarantine for 14 days with transportation and meals, but as well, equally as important, was that $2,000 stipend, because we know that farm workers earn between $25,000 to $35,000 a year, and every penny they make is very, very important. And so those $2,000 have gone a long way. And as a matter of fact, we actually received calls from other counties throughout the state of California and from other states like Oregon and Washington about this program. A $33 million rental assistance program that is the third largest per capita dedication of CARES Act funding for direct rental assistance by any county in the United States. And it provides a payment of up to $3,500 directly to the landlord to cover rent. As it comes to the challenges that our government has tackled, we have been able to do a lot on many fronts. In a sense, we have been able to create a pandemic playbook. We emphasize that we have a balanced approach to fight this pandemic and save lives, and also support our economy so individuals can get back to work cautiously, so that we will be able to support the quality of life in the aftermath of this pandemic. Being supportive of businesses goes hand in hand with public health measures such as wearing our face coverings, keeping a distance of 6 feet from non-household members, washing our hands, and being careful when we go out. It's just good sense, so we can do much better today than we were days, weeks, and even months ago. Today, we will explore what economic recovery looks like, what similarities and differences exist between the Great Recession and this epidemic-linked economic slowdown. With that, before we move on to our forecasts, I would like to introduce the UC Riverside School of Business Dean, Dr. Yunzeng Wang. Dean Wang joined the School of Business in 2008 as the Dean's Distinguished Scholar in Supply Chain Management and Professor of Finance and Management. An internationally renowned scholar, Dean Wang was named Dean of the School of Business, home to the A. Gary Anderson Graduate School of Management in 2014, after serving as interim dean since 2011. Dean Wang has brought great vision and leadership to the School of Business. During his tenure, the school introduced a master's in finance, a master's in professional accounting, and is in the final stages of preparing to launch a new master's in business analytics and an online MBA program. He has championed initiatives that enhance engagement and collaboration within the community and with business leaders in the region, including the Dean's Advisory Council, the Dean's Speaker Series, and the Executive Fellows Program. In addition, the school will be announcing the building site of the new UCR School of Business in a few weeks. with plans well underway for this new hub for business activity in the Inland Empire. Under Dean Wang's leadership, the school has risen in rankings to be among the top 100 best business schools in the nation. Please welcome Dean Youngzeng Wang.
Thank you, Supervisor Press, for that warm introduction. On behalf of the UC Riverside School of Business, its faculty, staff, and students, I would like to warmly welcome you to the 11th Annual Economic Forecast Conference and our very first virtual conference. I would also like to thank the many sponsors without whose support this conference would not be possible. Pacific Premier Bank, Riverside County Business and Community Services, Altura Credit Union, Bank of America, the KPC Group, Provident Bank, City of Ontario, School's First Federal Credit Union, the Inland Empire Business Journal, Cola 99.9, and the Brand Smith. I want to emphasize how grateful we are for these long-standing partnerships and their contributions to this important economic conference and to the UCR School of Business. Each year, this conference offers a unique opportunity for members of the Inland Empire community to gather and discuss the most important issues affecting the economic health and the future of our region. This year, it is especially important due to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic has had on every sector of our economy. One day the stock market is up, the next day it is plummeting. Headlines declare job growth one day and job losses the next. We are grateful to have top researchers and economists leading our UCR Center of Economic Forecasting and Development. Today, they will break down the leading indicators and other data and to share an insightful forecast for the coming year and beyond. We are grateful for the many partnerships we have across the Inland Empire with the counties, the cities, UC Riverside, the region's business and community leaders, all working together to provide resources and build the networks that support innovation and business growth for our region. Through our Center for Economic Forecasting and Development, we are committed to providing the research and the expertise that will continue to inform public policy, decision-making, and promote economic change and growth throughout our region. Thank you again and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Anytime during the presentations, please feel free to submit a question by using the Q&A option that appears in the bar at the bottom of your screen. We'll attempt to answer as many questions as possible, and apologies in advance for any we are unable to get to given time constraints. Now it is my pleasure to introduce the Director of the Center for Economic Forecasting and Development, Dr. Christopher Thornburg, who will be delivering an outlook for the US and California, an expert in economic and revenue forecasting, regional economics, economic policy, and labor and real estate markets. Dr. Thornburg has consulted for private industry, cities, counties, and public agencies in the Inland Empire, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle, Sacramento, Nevada, and other geographic areas across the nation. He is also an adjunct professor. Please help me welcome Dr. Christopher Thornburg.
The following program was made possible with the support of these sponsors. Pacific Premier Bank. When it comes to your business bank, you should expect a difference, offering businesses and individuals banking solutions with personalized service. and by Riverside County's business and community services, supporting the growth and expansion of business and the community in our region. Our silver sponsors include Altura Credit Union, supporting the community through sponsorship and scholarship opportunities, and Bank of America, helping you find the right products for your business needs with a wide range of solutions.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Chris Thormick, Director, of course, of the UC Riverside Center of Economic Forecasting and Development. It's a pleasure to have you with us this morning as we talk, of course, about the big trends that will be influencing the U.S., national, and state economy, and, of course, right down here into the Inland Empire region. Of course, we are truly extraordinary times from any sort of hysterical standpoint. We are in the midst of really the first epidemic-linked recession that we know of in U.S. economic history. And we probably have to start out of this entire conversation by just acknowledging the tragedy, of course, of the pandemic itself. Over 30 million cases globally, over 1 million deaths. Here in the United States, about 20% of cases, 20% of deaths. Overall, probably north of 250,000 Americans will die from the virus by the time we get it fully under control. Truly tragic, and of course our hearts go out for those families who've lost loved ones or have had loved ones obviously dealing with this disease for countless weeks. But the focus of the conversation this morning is not so much, of course, the virus itself, but the economic response to the virus. As you know, of course, the U.S. economy has gone through a very dramatic recession over the course of the last few months. Truly eye-popping numbers from the double-digit unemployment rate, the highest we've seen in the post-World War II period, of course, to that monumental 32% decline in economic activity in the second quarter of the year. Of course, the question is one of recovery at this point in time. How fast will the U.S. economy be able to bounce back from this sort of just truly head-shaking numbers that we've seen over the course of the last few months? And this, in turn, of course, brings us into the letter debate. As you know, there's been all sorts of predictions about what the economy is going to do, and lots of economists have come up with clever sort of symbols to reflect their view, whether it's a square root sign or the Nike swoosh or an L or a W, as the case may be. Putting all the letters and witty responses to one side, we know this really boils down to two main camps: the U folks versus the V folks. The U folks are very clear that this is going to be a long, painful recovery. Whether it's 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, they think it's very much like the Great Recession. The hit is here, and of course, to get back to normal levels of economic activity will take a long time. The V camp is saying something different. They're saying that while we acknowledge, of course, the pain that the pandemic has caused many, many people inside the United States, that is different than the conversation about where the economy is going. The people in the V camp, including, of course, the UC Riverside Center for Economic Forecasting, we think that the economy can, and already has in many ways, bounced back rapidly, despite, of course, the continued presence of the virus within our nation at this particular point in time. Now, those two views, the V versus U, often conflate multiple things, and I think it's worth unpacking them just a little bit. First of all, there is what you call the direction of the virus itself. How many new cases? When will we finally get control of it? When will we be able to open things up? The second part, of course, has to do with the economic response to the presence of the virus. And that's important because, as you'll see in the data, what happened during the first surge and what happened in the second surge, completely different. And that's important, of course, for thinking about where the economy is going. And then last but not least, there's the damage to the economy caused by the closure of the economy while the virus is actually here. This is the idea that many restaurants and many retail establishments will not reopen, and of course that means that those companies and the people who work for them will find themselves really out in the labor market looking for jobs. Again, for how long? We aren't quite sure at this particular point in time. Now, as noted, we have been talking V coming at the UC Riverside forecast. That's a little bit different. As you know, the vast majority of forecasts out there, including many right here in California, have really been part of the U camp. That is to say, they're predicting pretty grim things. And here's a selection of headlines over the course of the last few months. It will take, multiple years for the economy to get back to normal levels. The IMF is saying that this is very much like a depression-type crisis. Of course, a forecast organization right there in Los Angeles recently called this a depression-like crisis. A lot of use of the depression words. Maybe the best way of thinking about these U forecasts is to take a look at the CBO's outlook for the economy. That's the Congressional Budget Office. Now, this is not what you would call a typical forecast chart. Let me explain what you're seeing here. This is the CBO's projected gap between what the economy will produce versus what we are actually able to produce. The output gap, really driven, if you will, by the problems in the economy versus the overall capacity for the U.S. to produce goods and services on an annual basis. Take a look what happened during the Great Recession. The Great Recession was the worst recession in the post-World War II period. We saw about a 6% decline in real GDP between the fourth quarter of 2007 and the second quarter of 2009. But when you think about the pain of the Great Recession, it wasn't just the recession. It was the incredibly slow pace of the overall recovery. In fact, according to the data, we didn't fully recover for another 6.5 years. Overall, it was about a 7 to 8 year episode. Again, the worst since World War II. Now, if you look what the CBO is predicting into the future, it's a very similar sort of picture. Multiple years for the U.S. to get back to normal levels of economic overall output. This is a pretty grim forecast, and it doesn't matter what business if you're in. If you're looking at this, you are worried, and you're thinking about, of course, pulling back on a lot of your future plans. But, as we've noted in the past, this incredibly dismal forecast for the economy is really based on two things. One is the ongoing bout of miserabilism our nation has been suffering from. That is to say, a constant need to make everything significantly worse than it actually is. And a lot of it is that age-old cliche about the general always fighting the last war. You know, it's interesting. The very beginning of the Great Recession, I remember how a lot of economists were saying, well, it's not going to be that big of a deal. Why? Well, really, their entire rationale for that opinion had to do with the fact that the tech recession at the beginning of last decade and, of course, that early 1990s recession, that those were very mild downturns. They said, ergo, this one's going to be mild as well. Boy, were they wrong. And, of course, this time around, it seems like it's almost the same sort of logic. Well, the Great Recession was bad, ergo, this one must be bad too. Well, look, you cannot use the past recession as your basic ultimate predictor for this recession. The world doesn't work that way. Indeed, when this whole thing started, we said right off the bat, this is a V-shaped recovery. And the reason we said that, of course, is because this is not like the Great Recession, not in any way, shape, or form. Again, acknowledging the tragedy of the pandemic itself, it's a different kind of business cycle. When you think about the Great Recession and how painful it was in the U.S. economy, it had to do everything with the nature of that recession. That is to say, the collapse of the subprime bubble that dominated the economy for the 6 years prior to the Great Recession. You remember, anybody can get any amount of money they wanted from those consumer credit markets because Wall Street figured out a way of, quote unquote, removing risk from even bad debt through the securitization process. Honestly, one of the greatest financial frauds perpetuated in the history of the globe. Putting aside, of course, the fraud aspect of that, the real issue here had to do with the fact that $15 trillion of bad debt entering the U.S. economy caused the economy to expand in ways that were simply not sustainable. People borrowed too much. They spent too much. You saw savings rates drop to the lowest we've ever seen them, even as the U.S. economy began to open up a massive trade deficit. And of course, front and center in this national period of crazy excess was the housing market, which went through the roof like we never saw. With so many people bought homes they never should have bought, with money they never should have been allowed to borrow, at prices that should have never been allowed by the banks. But it did happen, and of course, when everything started to fall apart, really in the beginning to middle of 2006, it was only a function of time until a full-out recession occurred. And why was the recovery so slow and painful? Well, think about it. In the run-up to the recession, millions of jobs were generated in those sectors, consumer spending, consumer finance, and of course real estate, that were not sustainable. Indeed, in 2019, there were still fewer construction jobs in the U.S. than there were in 2006, just to give you some sense of that. Those millions of jobs were removed and removed permanently, and those people had to rebuild careers in other parts of the economy, a long, painful process. Equivalently, you came into that recession with people with way too much debt, and all that wealth they had collapsed away, and it took them years to rebuild their balance sheets. That is why it was such a painful, long recovery. And by the way, that tells us a little something about what creates bad recessions. This other worst recession in history was, of course, the Great Depression, which also followed the collapse of a massive financial bubble. This time around, we pointed out that not only is there no financial bubble, but of course the pandemic hit the U.S. economy when, fundamentally speaking, the U.S. was probably the healthiest it's been in over 30 years. We had the ability to weather even a serious storm, and indeed the fundamentals were very, very good. And of course what we said was, this thing's going to get back to normal relatively quickly. Now in June, we actually were quite happy to see that our initial optimistic forecasts will really look like they were coming true. The U forecasters were really caught off guard by the May jobs number. You remember April's numbers were truly horrendous. You saw millions of jobs erased from U.S. payrolls, and everybody said the unemployment rate, which had gotten close to 15%, was going to continue to go up, maybe as high as 19 or 20%. Well, the May numbers came in, and lo and behold, the U folks were really pushed off guard when instead unemployment fell, and we saw a positive overall jobs. And then later on in that month, when we started getting consumer spending numbers, it looked like, again, consumers were coming back in a relatively big way. Very good news. The V was already starting to happen. But we started to get some warning signs that maybe some of our optimism was a little bit off base, and that had largely to do with the path of the virus. The first surge in the number of cases really peaked in April of that particular year. And by the end of that month, you already saw the number of new cases start to come down. But by June, that had leveled off, and it looks like there was a new surge coming in the U.S. economy. Now July came, and we had a little bit of good news and a little bit of bad news. The good news was this: the recession ended. I know that seems odd, you haven't heard that yet, but to be clear, recessions are basically measured peak to trough. The peak of economic activity to the bottom of economic activity. The peak, of course, was in February prior to the virus really taking off, but the bottom of economic activity was clearly in April of this particular year. That's right, this is the deepest recession in U.S. economic history. It is also the shortest, only 2 months. And since then, the economy's been roaring back towards normal levels of economic output. Now, other good news had to do with, of course, the federal stimulus plan, which injected trillions of dollars into the U.S. economy and in many ways has supercharged the economy for when we finally can fully get rid of the virus and allow the economy to reopen. Very, very good news, and it gives us even more optimism about the ability for the economy to come back. The bad news in July? Well, it turns out that the flattening number of cases turned into a new surge, a significantly worse surge a second time around. And by the end of July, early August, we saw the most number of new cases since the pandemic began in the U.S. Now, in August and September, a little bit of silver linings. The silver linings was this: despite the fact that we had the second surge, we saw no massive drop-off in economic activity. Indeed, the most you can say is that the economic recovery slowed down a bit. The difference between the first and second surge is profound and something that people don't talk about nearly enough. Now, obviously, the number of new cases has come down, but we still are not over. And right now in the U.S., things have basically stabilized. In the rest of the globe, we've seen another surge in the number of new cases. And while we don't think this is going to generate another new recession in the U.S. economy, clearly things have slowed down a bit. And we've had to push out our date of full recovery from really the end of this year to somewhere more in the middle to the third quarter of next year. But again, it doesn't mean the V is dead. It's just flattened out just a little bit. Remember, we've already recovered quite a bit. So let's get right into the data. Let's talk about where we are right now and where we see things heading. As noted, the second quarter of this year was a truly eye-popping negative 32%. The worst quarter ever recorded in U.S. economic history was negative 10%, to put this in context. Now, do bear in mind that the 32% is a little bit exaggerated because we like to do things in annualized form. You need to divide that by 4 to get a better sense of things. Nevertheless, overall, from peak to trough, about 11% real decline in economic activity. And most of this, of course, was driven by consumer spending. Consumers, of course, pulled back, whether because of government regulations that basically forbade them from having certain economic transactions or just sheer personal fear of the virus itself. People ended up pulling back. And you can see it here, obviously, healthcare, food and accommodation, recreation services, other services, parts of consumer spending that have been hit quite dramatically. But as bad as those second numbers were, let's talk a little bit about what's happened since the actual bottom of things. So, of course, leading the charge on the economic recovery has been the American consumer. Take a look at the left-hand side. You can see the trends in real consumer spending broken down between goods and services. Services are still way down from where they were pre-recession. Not a big surprise. That is where, of course, travel, recreation, various sorts of entertainment options such as restaurants are actually in the economic statistics. Goods, on the other hand, whether it's autos or tents or workout equipment, believe it or not, goods have bounced back tremendously. They are above trend. So it's interesting how Americans have responded to the crisis. They aren't spending as much, but what they have done was shifted their spending from some parts of the economy to other parts of the economy. There are winners and losers, as the case may be. And overall retail sales, of course, is, believe it or not, one of the winners. You can see just how quickly retail sales have bounced back. Indeed, over the last 3 months, they've been above trend. Now, this really threw a lot of manufacturers and retails into a bit of a tizzy because they were not prepared for this. Take a look at the left-hand side here. This is a ratio of inventory to sales for the retail sector in the U.S. And you can see the massive bounce in inventory sales ratio at the beginning of this when sales disappeared. And then nobody was anticipating the enormous bounce back. And of course, they got caught off guard when sales came roaring back. Now sales, what's roaring back? Take a look on the right-hand side. And again, there are winners and losers. It is not equivalent. Clothing and clothing accessory stores, still way down. Of course, restaurants still down about 17% on a year-on-year basis. Gasoline also down about 16%. After all, we're not driving anywhere. But at the top of the list, building materials, food and beverage stores, sporting goods, health and personal care stores, and of course, top of the list, of course, non-store realtors. That's our fancy way of saying the internet. So a lot of folks are spending a lot of money. Again, we are above trend at this particular point in time. Now, mind you, the press doesn't like to talk about things in any positive sort of ways nowadays. And this is one of the newspaper articles that came out in August. Oh, retail sales growth slowed because of the end of stimulus checks. They didn't slow because of the end of stimulus checks. They slowed because they were above trend. Remember, only certain parts of the economy are lagging behind right now. And of course, with the big bounce back in spending, we are starting to see the resultant surge both in production activity as well as imports. If you take a look at the ports of LA and Long Beach, 4 months ago they were empty. Today they are packed to the rim because retailers are trying to restock their warehouses because of the unanticipated surge in overall consumer spending. Now, with that in mind, obviously not everything has gone to plan. The big place I think we missed in our original forecast was we thought we really had gotten some control over this virus. But it didn't really work out that way. As you could see, by June of this particular year, we saw another big surge inside the United States, substantially worse than the first surge. Now, the United States has more or less been steady over the course of the last couple of months. Maybe a little bit of a pop. We certainly haven't come back down to levels we were back in June, but things are steady. But of course, you could see the problems in the rest of the globe. The European Union, the United Kingdom, seeing a new surge in cases. This virus is still among us. It's still creating problems. In the U.S., things have just settled down. If you get a little closer to home, take a look at various states. Again, you can see relatively good news. California, for example, is way beyond the peak of number of new cases. By the way, so is Arizona, so is Florida. This is not a second wave of the virus. A true second wave is when you see a whole bunch of new cases in a place like New York or New Jersey that were on the leading edge of this. These are what I would call second surges, perhaps even third surges, driven by the virus simply getting into places it hasn't been yet. That seems to be one of the characteristics of this virus. It's going to basically be in every part of the world at some level. It's just a function of when, not if. But once you get to a certain number of cases, it doesn't seem to be as much of a problem. It sounds a lot like herd immunity. I appreciate that. But it's not the same as herd immunity. I think it has to do, obviously, also quite a bit with the level of caution exhibited by people in different parts of the United States. However you want to look at it, the point here is, of course, things have stabilized. And you want to get a little closer to California, talk about where we are. Well, in terms of the number of new tests, nice and steady. Look at new cases. We're actually per million people below the nation by a good margin. Hospitalizations are down. And of course, most importantly, new deaths are down as well. We have learned at many ways to deal with this virus. And of course, as a result of that, while it's still severe, it's still a little bit scary, at the same time, it's not as much of a, if we will, unknown danger the way it was in March and April. And of course, because of the reduction in cases, some things are becoming normal. For example, a number of states in the East, including New York and New Jersey, basically required anybody going to California to now be quarantined if they were to go back east. Because of number of new cases have come down so much, the quarantine is now lifted and you are able to go to New Jersey again. I'm sure you're very excited about that. But here's the most important thing. Remember, the first time we had insurgent cases, which is nothing like the second surge, look how tremendous the economic reaction was. Enormous decline in overall spending. Second time around, none at all. All you could say really is it slowed down the recovery just a little bit. This is important because it gets back to what happens over the course of the next 6-7 months, even if we don't have, of course, a vaccination for this virus. Well, the data suggests that we are learning to live with COVID. It's as simple as that. Whether you're a business or an individual consumer, this has become something you can deal with. People understand the risks and they're basically operating as normally as they can. This is completely different in April where no one really understood what we were dealing with. And it means, of course, that even without a vaccination, the U.S. economy can continue to get back to normal levels of overall economic output. Can we ever get back to fully 100% level? That's a hard question to answer. I think there will be some gaps as long as the virus is around, but clearly we are getting back to normal relatively quickly. The housing market, of course, showed something very similar. The bounce in housing activity was phenomenal. Again, you heard a lot of dismal predictions of record forecasts and 15% foreclosure rates and everything else. Well, there was, of course, again, a sharp showdown in sales. Since May of this year, in the U.S. overall, sales have come roaring back. And as opposed to, of course, prices falling the way a lot of posts were predicting, actually home prices at this point in time are accelerating. They're growing at a more rapid pace. Coming a little closer to home, you see a very similar pattern here in California. An enormous drop-off in the second quarter, a roaring back in the third quarter, above where we were a little bit more in the third quarter of last year. And on the right-hand side, you can see inventories of homes for sale in California. We are now, over the last 2 months, at one of the tightest housing markets we've ever seen in California, going all the way back, of course, to the massive bubble generated by the subprime situation pre-Great Recession. This is a tight housing market, and it's one that's not going to drop by any stretch of the imagination. And you can see how median prices have come roaring back as well. Again, this is a housing market that's on fire. It's being driven in large part by low interest rates, but also by the fact that people, well, I mean, you don't have much else to do right now except for think about getting into a nicer home. And a lot of people are thinking about that. So the housing market is doing just great. And housing permits have bounced back. Remember, one of the ongoing conversations we've had at the UC Riverside Center has been about the desperate need for housing supply in California. The beginning of this, housing permits dropped off pretty sharply. They bounced back, which is some relief. But of course, we really need them to be much, much higher than this if the state is ever going to dig its way out of this massive housing shortage. Not only do we have all that great news on the housing market, but of course, you also can see all the good news in the financial markets themselves. This is overall debt delinquencies in consumer debt markets. Now, at the beginning of this, again, if you turn on CNBC, you were probably privy to seeing all sorts of hedge fund billionaires screaming about the end of the financial world. Now, some of this, of course, was the general fighting the last war. Again, it was bad during the Great Recession, ergo it must be bad this time. But as we've noted right from the get-go, this is not a Great Recession type scenario. Indeed, we pointed out that as opposed to the beginning of the Great Recession, where we were record debt-to-income levels, we were already seeing problems in debt markets. We came into this one after years of slow debt accumulation. And overall, the financial obligations ratio, that is to say the share of household income being spent on financial obligations, was near a record low level. And of course, when you look at the second quarter numbers, amazingly, delinquency rates of consumer debt dropped. They didn't increase. Now, some of this, of course, has to do with some government policy, but a lot of it also has to do with how consumers have been dealing both with the inability to spend as well as the massive amount of income that's come in, driven by, of course, the federal stimulus program. But before we get there, I think we have to acknowledge that for all the good news, Some sectors, of course, are not actually keeping up. Take a look at this graph here. Now, this is data from Opportunity Insights, which is a wonderful data source for very high-frequency data based on credit card numbers. And what's nice about this data, not only that we can all get it by simply going to Opportunity Insights, but they have it broken down, of course, by sector. And overall total spending as of August this year was down about 7.3%. But of course, transportation, that's airplanes, down almost 50%, and restaurants and hotels down 26%. Again, it's a very much a bifurcated recovery. Subsectors are roaring back while others remain behind. Hotels, of course, front and center on this. You can see overall daily occupancy rates coming back inside the U.S. bit by bit. We're still way below the peak pre-pandemic, but there has been some recovery. On the right-hand side, this is TSA pass-throughs. Yet again, airports are seeing a little bit more activity, but still 40% down from where they were last year at this particular point in time. Again, things are getting back to slowly, and these sectors at a just a snail's pace, is the best you could say. And of course, if you look at California occupancy rates, as of July of this year, unfortunately, most recent data, occupancy rates were about 50% down below, relative to, say, above 70% they were at in February of this year. Now here, yet again, there's a bifurcated recovery. It's interesting, if you actually kind of go hotel by hotel, there's two kinds of hotels out there. There are hotels that are attached to convention centers, that are attached to amusement parks. Think of the hotels in Anaheim or the hotels in San Francisco. These are empty. Business travel isn't occurring. Obviously, conferences aren't occurring. And the hotels attached to these kind of what I would call airplane travel, well, those hotels are functionally vacant. But putting that to one side, if you look at hotels that deal with what I call drive-through tourism, whether you're talking about a nice beach hotel in Orange County or along the Central Coast, or perhaps even some of the smaller boutique hotels out in Palm Springs, what you are dealing with, of course, is the opposite. People are desperate to get out of their house, and those hotels are charging higher rates and earning more money than last year. It all depends on what part of the market you're dealing with. Some places are doing very, very well. Now, again, it's a bifurcated recovery. Even going back to the retail sector, you remember, of course, about how retail sales are above trend, but that is driven largely by online sales. Those brick and mortar stores are suffering tremendously right now. And indeed, we expect that the retail shakeout is going to be tremendous. It isn't driven by the recession. Remember, retail was already under phenomenal stress by, of course, the growing share of retail sales that were coming online. It was already a big problem. They were already suffering. The only thing the pandemic has done is hasten this. And boy, has it hastened it. Overall, we went from below 12% of overall retail sales going to online sellers to 16% in very short order. And I can tell you right now, this is not going to reverse itself. So yeah, the retail world, when it comes to brick and mortar, is suffering. But of course, if you're online, you're doing tremendous. And that even gets us into what I would call kind of thinking about commercial permits overall. It's still too early to talk much about what's going to happen in the commercial market. After all, leases means it's very much a lagging indicator. But of course, the panic has set in, and the overall number of new permits has gone down tremendously. But we think when the smoke clears, what you're going to find is, yet again, retail is going to suffer, but other parts of the economy, including industrial, which is so important in the Inland Empire region, is going to do just fine, again, because of local distribution. And the ultimate lagging indicator, of course, is employment. Employment, of course, always lags behind. Now, this is where we have one of the stranger conversations, because one of the odd things about this particular recession was how employment is both leading and lagging. Now, the reason I say that, of course, is because, remember, at the beginning of this, a lot of payroll jobs disappeared from the U.S. economy, but they weren't truly lost. Rather, these were people who said, I'm not working right now, not because I've lost my job, but because I can't go to my job because of the presence of the virus in our economy today. They were on temporary layoff. Now, over time, you are seeing people who are on temporary layoff going back to work, and that's what accounts for the relatively big bounce in the overall number of jobs. We've been well over halfway back to where we were pre-recession, but it is slowing down a bit because, of course, of really two things. One is the ongoing presence of the virus, which is preventing full recovery in some sectors, and at the same time, it has to do with the fact that, yes, because of the growing stress in the U.S. economy due to the present pandemic, more of those quote-unquote temporary layoffs are turning into permanent layoffs, as the case may be. And on the right-hand side, you can see the data for California. Again, at the beginning of this, the state overall lost about 2.6 million payroll jobs. But of course, we've already seen about 886 of those thousand jobs coming back. And while we're still down where we were, we're coming back. Where are the big hits to the economy? Not a big surprise. Recreation, a combination of food, other services. These are places in many ways that are simply being shut down by government fiat more than anything else. And of course, information is largely being driven by the movie industry and the lack of any kind of production in that particular sector. But again, you got to be a little careful about what these numbers actually mean. Here's a breakdown looking at over the last 20 or 30 years. And you can see the gap again between the temporary layoff and those who are truly looking for new employment. At the beginning of this, it was all temporary layoff. That surged almost to 12%. We've never seen anything like that before. In fact, the highest it had ever been is about 2.7%, and that was way back in the 1970s. Now, that number has come down very sharply, but you can see, of course, the shaded areas. These are people who truly have no jobs, whether they're re-entering the labor market looking for a new job or they've lost their job permanently. Things have gotten worse. And here's a little bit of a breakdown of just the last couple of years. You can see it really much more clear this way. You can see again how the number of folks who are on what I would call permanent job, they're dealing with permanent job loss has been increasing, but it isn't all that high. Right now, with the September numbers in there, it's running about 4.8%. To put that in context, during the very mild tech recession, that number was at about 5.5%. From a long-run standpoint, at this point in time, this still looks like a mild recession, but again, it's still a mild recession. We're not all the way back at this point in time. And yes, it's very much a K-shaped recovery. Now, what economists mean when they say that, of course, is that not all people are dealing with this equally. In fact, many high-skilled folks are doing just fine. In fact, most high-skilled folks are doing just fine. The unemployment rate for people with a college degree or more got up to about 7%. Now it's down to about 5%. However, those without a high school degree, you saw their unemployment rate shoot up to well over 20%. Now it's down to about 13%. It's those low-skilled jobs, the ones that are in restaurants and personal care and, of course, hotels. Those are the ones that are still on the outside looking in. And while we have to appreciate the stress it's putting on those households, putting on those individual workers, overall, the majority of people in the U.S., particularly the majority of high-income people, continue to move ahead appropriately. Their businesses are still operating and they're still earning income. And if you want to break it down a little bit inside California, yet again, you could see how bifurcated this is. If you're involved in tourism, if you're Orange County, if you're San Francisco, you're getting hit significantly worse. However, the Inland Empire, as Tanner will talk about in just a couple of minutes, is not doing as badly. A little less of a tourism sector as the case may be, and remember, of course, the Inland Empire is so important to logistics and local supply that that part of the world, of California, is doing better than the overall state. Good news there. And of course, while we worried about small businesses and what's happening and the loss of jobs there is actually some very good news on that particular front. As much as we know there's a lot of businesses suffering out there, they're dealing with, of course, how do we deal with all those fixed costs while it was closed? A lot of them may not reopen, but you can see the resilience of California small businesses here. Take a look at this is the data on California business applications. It's a great data set. The census has been collecting it for about 15, 16 years now. And no, your eyes do not deceive you. After a big slowdown, it has come roaring back. People are eager to get going on business again. They're just waiting for the economy to reopen, and you've never seen applications surge to this high a level. Again, for me, it says that yes, at some level, there's no doubt that this is creating a lot of economic stress, but people are resilient, they're mitigating, and they're already thinking ahead. And by the way, that's exactly what you should be thinking about when you're making your plans over the next year or so. And even when it gets, of course, into government policy. Now, of course, with the optimism of all these small businesses, the real question is, will that optimism be met by, of course, the kind of increases in demand that will allow that new business to go ahead and succeed? Well, that, of course, gets into government policy and, more importantly, of course, the government stimulus effort that went into place. Now, as you know, right now, there's a lot of controversy because the federal government seems unable to pass a second stimulus bill. I will say this, though. I don't think it's necessary outside some small things. I realize that's a little bit of a controversial statement, but let me explain my reasoning. Look, the first stimulus was something like we've never seen before. The government pledged close to $3 trillion of stimulus to the U.S. economy. And we know that a lot of that money went to places it was desperately needed. For example, to the unemployed. They did a nice job expanding both who could get unemployment insurance as well as expanding how much money those folks could actually get. Now, it wasn't rolled out all that well. California, for example, is dealing with a lot of fraud in the unemployment system right now. But putting all that to one side, we know it was a very successful program. But then we started looking at other parts of this, whether we're talking about the $1,200 that went to all these individuals or indeed these PPP loans that went to companies that should not have needed a lot of help, like law firms and other professional business firms. Then we started wondering, is this truly helpful? In a lot of ways, this doesn't seem like it's something that's going to help the economy right now, because remember, the issue is not that people can't spend money because they don't have money, it's they can't spend money because they can't spend money, because of the presence of the virus. So you poured $3.5 trillion into the economy, and most of that money has yet to actually, of course, create the kind of economic activity stimulus that you'd want it to, because the virus is still among us. And by the way, it isn't just, of course, the federal government itself. The Federal Reserve has gotten involved as well with, of course, cutting interest rates and a massive amount of quantitative easing. No matter how you look at it, this actually is already an overwhelming, of course, policy response. So when we think about this massive amount of government stimulus, what exactly does it mean? Well, take a look at this particular graph. On the left-hand side, this is personal income. That's income going to households, whether it's through government benefits or your salary from your place of work, or, of course, the profits from your company if you happen to be a proprietor. The data here is absolutely amazing. As much as labor markets have been impacted by this, for every dollar of lost income, the government has put back $2 in terms of overall stimulus payment. Amazingly, 2 for 1. And what that means is, despite the fact that the unemployment rate is still elevated, overall income levels, personal income levels, are actually above trend at this particular point in time. Now remember, the problem in the U.S. economy today is that people cannot spend money. They can't go to Disneyland. They can't go on that trip to Paris. They can't go to the favorite restaurant. So if they have more and more money coming in because of government benefits and they can't spend it, where does it go? And the answer is, of course, savings. And savings rates have gone through the roof. We've never seen savings rates quite as high as this. And remember, when you think about economic activity, it's not actually low-income households that are behind. It's high-income households. Going yet again to that Opportunity Insights data, you can see it here. You can see on a year-over-year basis, low-income households are only a couple percent of points down from where they were pre-COVID, whereas high-income households, of course, are way behind. You think of all that dry powder there, and you understand as soon as the virus is brought under control and restaurants and Disneyland and airlines can reopen, you will see this money pouring out of those accounts and roaring into the economy. How much money are we talking about? Well, again, these are two graphs that should let you really have a lot of confidence about the ability for this economy to rebound. On the left-hand side is commercial bank deposits, which have zoomed up by almost $2.5 trillion in 6 months. We've never seen anything like this. And on the right-hand side is the month-by-month savings for overall households that came out of that personal income statistics. And here it turns out, of that $2.5 trillion of new deposits, well over half of that is deposits from households, because they've tucked away about $1.5 trillion in overall new savings because they can't spend right now. Now let's again think about why the stock market's on fire and why people want to buy homes, because they're sitting on a lot of money right now, and of course that's driving those parts of the economy. The biggest problem for banks right now is, what do you do with this money? Well, I'll tell you what they're doing in the short run. They are buying government securities. Now that shouldn't be much of a surprise, because obviously the swing factor here is government borrowing. I'm amazed by all the people screaming at the top of their lungs for yet another stimulus plan, despite the fact that it's obvious that the first stimulus plan is still waiting there ready to get this economy going again once we get control over the virus. Putting more money in there is just going to make savings go up again. It's not going to actually help the economy move forward. And we also have to remember this. This is not free money. This is one of the things that makes me most sad about this debate. We are leaving a legacy for our children and grandchildren that we should be embarrassed about. $4 trillion in borrowing in the next year because of the stimulus plan and because of the fact that we already had $1 trillion deficit even before COVID showed up on our shores. This is money that will have to be paid back. And by the way, we're already heading headlong into a fiscal crisis driven by, of course, Medicare and Social Security. It's unbelievable to me that we continue to just talk about spending more and more with not a tiny thought to the generations coming behind us. Honestly, you know, we're borrowing more money today as percent of GDP than we did during World War II. Think of that for just a second. They called them, of course, the greatest generation. They're going to call us the whiny generation, and we deserve that particular level. And by the way, that's also true here in California. It's amazing to me that they're talking about raising taxes, increasing the overall income tax. Indeed, we heard stories about the state dealing with something over a $50 billion budget deficit. But remember, the state gets most of its money from, of course, personal income taxes. And because of the huge flood of money into the economy, because most high-skilled people are doing just fine, personal income taxes are not dropping. In fact, overall, the state has done much better than they've been expecting to. Not only last fiscal year, but coming into this fiscal year, month after month, the numbers come in much better than anybody in Sacramento had talked about. As opposed to Sacramento thinking about ways it can raise more money, it should be thinking long and hard about local governments, because those are the folks who are actually suffering through this particular situation. They're the ones who rely on sales taxes. Those are the ones who rely on transient occupancy taxes, and those are the parts of the economy that are dried up. The state's doing fine. It needs to focus on local government and help them through, obviously, this difficult situation. But that conversation isn't happening. And of course, when we think about, of course, the Federal Reserve, we know at the beginning of this, there was a massive financial panic, not the least, of course, driven by all those hedge fund billionaires trying to spike the market on those CNBC interviews. And they, of course, have cut rates. They've gotten involved with very hectic, a crazy degree of quantitative easing. In other words, they're responding just like they did after the Great Recession. But as already noted, this isn't the Great Recession. The Great Recession, of course, was driven largely by a collapse in wealth. There has been no collapse in wealth. Take a look at this data coming through the second quarter of this particular year. Amazingly, wealth came back in the second quarter, even as the unemployment rate was going up. Yes, a lot of this was government borrowing. A lot of this was the fact that the housing market has resurged. And of course, a lot of it has to do with the fact that the stock market has come roaring back. There is no collapse in wealth. Ergo, we don't need this ferocious degree of monetary easing. But they're doing it anyway. So let's think about what the Federal Reserve has been doing. Obviously, they are acting as if there's a collapse in wealth and deflationary pressures when there is no collapse in wealth, and obviously inflation is already starting to creep in again. And you get a little deeper into the data, and what do you start to see? Well, the Fed balance sheet is expanding, and because overall wealth levels have not collapsed, because spending has come back, we have suddenly seen an explosion in the money supply. M2 growth has been running about 25% over the course of the last 2 months. That is a scary high number. And if this all sounds inflationary to you, that's exactly right. It is inflationary, unlike after the Great Recession, where it was not. Now, this should all worry us, because what are we talking about? We're talking about a government that seems to be willing to borrow any amount of money they can get away with, and a Federal Reserve who is absolutely comfortable with more inflation. To me, this sounds like a lot like the late 1970s, and of course we understand that it eventually led to both very high inflation rates, as well as, of course, when Volcker came in to fight inflation and sunk us into, at that point in time, was the worst recession post-World War II in the early part of the 1980s. This is scary stuff, and we should be paying attention to it. But we're not. We're too busy talking about what is going on right now. We're not talking about a recovery. We continue to talk about this as being a long-run depression-type situation, despite the roaring back of the overall economy. Now, last but not least, we should talk about the long run. Because yes, over the course of the next 6 months or a year, we will eventually get control over this virus. And then we have to ask ourselves, well, will people be scarred? Will people go back to ball games? Will they go back to malls? And the answer is absolutely they will. Look, epidemics are not a new normal. Epidemics have been with humanity since the dawn of civilization. Shakespeare famously wrote King Lear while he was holed up in his house, hiding from the plague that was ripping through London. And when the plague left, he reopened the Globe Theatre, and Londonians flooded in to watch his brand new play. People are already eager to go out and live their lives again. Just look at the college parties or what happens when you open a beach or really do anything that allows people to aggregate. They are hungry to go out and do it. So no, I don't think there's going to be a new normal. The places where you're going to see big shifts in the economy really boil down to places that were already under a lot of stress. For example, retail. We discussed how retail was under stress because of the internet, and this is going to accelerate that situation. We need to think about what to do about that retail land, and we should think about it right now. I have a modest idea. I think the good folks in Sacramento should make a new law that takes all retail land and rezones it mixed use, retail/residential. That will help retail, and it'll help our housing shortage. Now, of course, obviously, when you think about music conferences, music events, music concerts, overall business conferences, those are lagging behind as well. And with the reemergence of COVID in parts of Europe, we know global trade and global tourism will continue to be influenced as well. Clearly, there are some lagging influences that this thing cannot go away 100%. And in the commercial space, yet again, kind of a mixed bag. It's very interesting. Industrial is seeing its value in this particular situation. Not only is it local distribution that's booming, but of course, trade is coming back. Retail, obviously, as noted, going to be a big hit. Office, I think, is an interesting conversation because what businesses have learned is that you can actually have your folks work from home and still be productive, still make a profit. And I think that's really good news, of course, for California, whose highways are overwhelmed by commuters. Allowing your folks to work from home 2 days a week is going to help a lot of things. Your workers' lives, those roadways, pollution, everything else. Now, does that mean the end of office space as we know it? And of course, yet again, that's a bit of an exaggeration. It's an exaggeration because while people can work from home, it's not always optimal. Whether it's training or just a creative process, or indeed the ability to go out with lunch with your coworkers once in a while, I think we've all realized that being at home all the time is not optimal either. I think what this means overall is you will start to see diminished demand for office space over the course of the next 5-6 years as we do more and more work over Zoom and less work in conference rooms themselves. But again, that's going to be a gradual change, not a dramatic one. So wrapping it up, summing up, look, this is not good. And again, we have to acknowledge the pain that this pandemic has caused so many millions of Americans in terms of lost loved ones, of course, their own individual suffering if they have had the disease and gotten over it. But with that in mind, it is not that bad. It is not a Great Recession type scenario. It is not a Depression type scenario. The V is the only logical outcome of this. But of course, the pace of that V all depends on getting the virus fully under control. Yes, the V is flattened out again because of the second surge, but now, as long as we get control over this, we anticipate September, October, November, we'll yet again see it coming up. As noted, negative 32% in the second quarter of the year, followed by a 36% growth rate in the fourth quarter. And unemployment is already at 7.9% in the U.S. It's going to be well below 7%, perhaps even at 6% by the end of this particular year. The economy is roaring back. It's not even a conversation. But the only way to get back to 100%, of course, is to get this virus more under control than it is right now, and we haven't gotten there yet. And that, of course, I think obviously brings me to the saddest part of this entire conversation. You know, one of my ongoing themes over the course of the last few years is this idea of miserableism, where no matter what happens, no matter how good it is, we have allowed the political radicalization of our nation to cause us to want to dismiss that and make everything worse than it is. And I'll tell you, it's a huge problem because it's really taken us away from what's important, what we need to be doing, the things we should be focused on, and instead devolved us into this they did, we did kind of political debate. Here we had an opportunity to pull together, to work together, to get control of this virus, and we didn't do it. Instead, we yet again allowed miserableism to take over. And as opposed to having reasonable policy, we've had unreasonable policy. Policy that's going to leave a legacy of trillions of dollars in debt for our children and grandchildren, a legacy of probably more economic damage than we actually needed, a legacy, of course, of perhaps more deaths than we actually needed. This, yet again, is driven by miserableism. Folks, we need to take a step back. We need to recognize that the economy is healthy and is roaring back, And what we need to do is wear our masks, wash our hands, do the right things, help get control of this virus. Other things will take care of themselves. But even wearing a mask has become a political debating point at this particular point in time. And boy, if that isn't tragic, if that isn't the height of tragic, I don't know what is. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Tanner and let him walk you through the local situation. But again, go out, have fundamental confidence in the ability for this economy to come back, continue to think about the long run for your business, for the state. Remember, this is transitory. We're going to get over it fast. It's just a matter of focusing on the right things. Thank you very much.
Dr. Thornburg, that was brilliant. And there were so many great points that you made from explaining the V versus U camp to talking about the difference in 2008 and that recession and what's going on now with the current efforts that we are moving forward with as far as building the economy and the pandemic playing a major role in the current recession. A shift in consumer spending. I appreciate your points there as well. And unfortunately, how there are some winners and there are some losers. You talked about the first surge and how that impacted us and how the second surge did not have such a major impact on consumer spending as the first. Appreciate the points you made with the issues on tourism. And as you mentioned, the drive-through tourism, which is doing well, versus tourism that's based, for example, hotels and restaurants that are based at airports, and how they are they've been hit hard because of this pandemic. Appreciate the discussion you had regarding that this is a mild recession, and we need to still look at it as a recession. There were so many great points that you made, Dr. Thornburg, and I just want to thank you for all that and for explaining that. But the main point, I think, as well, was your ending point, which was the idea, the concept of miserabilism, and that we do need to take a step back, and we do not need to be miserable, and that we need to base our, as a policymaker, myself, and obviously for the business community that's listening, is to pay attention to our public health officers and for everyone to do their part. And so, yes, continue to wear a mask, and yes, to continue to social distance and do the basic things that our mothers and fathers taught us as we were growing up as kids. And so a lot of great points, Dr. Thornburg, and I'm sure we're gonna have some questions later that you'll be able to address. And with that, it paves the way for the regional economic outlook for the Inland Empire now. And to deliver that, we are lucky to have with us Dr. Tanner Osmond, who is the manager of regional and sub-regional analysis at the Center for Economic Forecasting and Development. Now, Dr. Osmond is also a postdoctoral researcher at the Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies and an instructor in the Department of Urban Planning at the University of California, Los Angeles. His research focuses on how local economic development and land use policies affect the performance of industries and regional economies. He also specializes on the impact of high technology industries on local economies. Dr. Osmond co-authored the book, The Rise and Fall of Urban Economies, a comparative study of the Bay Area and Los Angeles economies, published by Stanford University Press. He also publishes scholarly work in the areas of economic development, regional economics, and land use planning. Please welcome Dr. Tanner Osmond.
The following program was made possible with support of these sponsors. Pacific Premier Bank. When it comes to your business bank, you should expect a difference, offering businesses and individuals banking solutions with personalized service. And by Riverside County's Business and Community Services, supporting the growth and expansion of business and the community in our region. Our silver sponsors include Altura Credit Union, supporting the community through sponsorship and scholarship opportunities. And Bank of America, helping you find the right products for your business needs with a wide range of solutions. And we would also like to thank our bronze sponsors, the City of Ontario, the Business Gateway to Southern California, Provident Bank, emphasizing personal service and customer convenience in attending to the financial needs of businesses, individuals, and families. Schools First Federal Credit Union, serving the needs of the educational community throughout California. The KPC Group, pursuing excellence by fulfilling the needs of the people while contributing to the improvement of the community. Our media sponsors include the Inland Empire Business Journal, the official business news publication for Southern California's Inland Empire region, and KOLA 99.9 FM, playing classic hits across Southern California for over 20 years. And finally, our creative sponsor, the Brandsmith, fueling your growth through strategic marketing and creative services.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to be focusing on the Inland Empire economy, where we were entering the pandemic, how the economy has performed during and recovered from the worst effects of the pandemic. So my presentation today is going to be divided into four primary parts. First, I'm going to be giving an update on the spread of the coronavirus in the Inland Empire. The good news is that the picture has been improving since the peak that we saw over the summertime. Just as we've seen the number of cases fall in California, we've seen them fall in the Inland Empire as well. Second, I'm going to be looking at where we stood prior to the outbreak of the coronavirus in the United States. One of our best guides to how the economy is going to recover from the fallout of the pandemic is the type of shape that the economy was in entering the pandemic. And the good news is that the Inland Empire was on very solid ground prior to the outbreak of the pandemic. In the rest of my presentation, I'm going to be looking at what the impact of the fallout from the coronavirus has been on the Inland Empire economy. And I'm going to primarily be looking at the labour market. The good news is that the labour market in the Inland Empire has performed better than the state's labour market. The less good news is that there's still a long way to go before we can return to the employment levels that we had prior to the breakout of the pandemic. And then finally, I'm going to be looking at the real estate picture in the Inland Empire. Just as we've seen nationally and in California, we've seen a very strong rebound in the residential real estate market. And there are some interesting questions for us to ponder about the state of the commercial real estate market in the Inland Empire. So first, I'm going to be, as I mentioned, providing a quick update as to where things stand with respect to the spread of the coronavirus in the Inland Empire. And the good news is that that peak that we saw in the end of July, moving into August, is behind us. And the number of new cases recorded on a daily basis in both Riverside and San Bernardino County has dropped by around about 75%. So given that the primary reason for the economy that we have experienced was the spread of the coronavirus, the good news is that for now, the worst spread of the virus is behind us. And I'm not an epidemiologist, but the hope is that going forward, we won't return to the levels of spread that we saw in both the spring and the summertime. Just as we saw good news with respect to the spread of the coronavirus, we're also seeing good news in relation to the number of deaths that have been recorded in both Riverside County and San Bernardino County. We have seen the number of deaths fall as the spread of the virus has fallen. So thankfully, it seems that for now the worst of the virus is behind us, and we hope that these trends will continue as we head into the winter. Hospitalizations as well, finally, it's just another gauge on how well the Inland Empire has been performing with respect to the virus. Again, we peaked in the middle of the summer, and ever since then the number of hospitalizations related to the coronavirus has been dropping. And this is all good news because, as I mentioned before, the primary reason why economic activity had contracted both nationally in California and in the Inland Empire as well was due to efforts to contain the coronavirus and consumer and people's reaction to the spread of the coronavirus. So if we begin increasingly to enter a world whereby the spread of the virus is contained in the Inland Empire, we would expect to see the economy recover in sync. Okay, so where were we before this tsunami hit us in March of this year? How was the Inland Empire performing at that time with respect to its economy? Well, the good news is that the Inland Empire's economy has been somewhat of a juggernaut since the Great Recession, and this can be viewed in a number of different ways. First, with respect to job growth, we've seen very impressive job growth in the Inland Empire, compared not only to the state of California, but also compared to the neighboring counties in the Southern California region. There are a number of different ways that we can look at this, but in the table that you will see on the right, you can see that from 2018 to 2019, the Inland Empire added jobs at double the rate of the state of California. And this continues a trend which has been occurring over a longer period. Okay, if we look at the expansion of payrolls in the Inland Empire and compare it to California and its neighbors in Southern California, we can see that job growth has occurred at a much faster rate in the Inland Empire compared to these other places since the Great Recession. I'd also like you to sort of cast your eyes to the table on the right, where you can see that over the past 5 years, only the city of San Francisco has seen stronger job growth than the Inland Empire. The city of San Francisco's growth, of course, has been fueled by the tech expansion that has been occurring in the region. But you can see that compared to many other parts or all other major areas within the state of California, over the past 5 years leading up to 2019, the Inland Empire was outgrowing these places. Prior to the onset of the global pandemic, we also saw that the unemployment rate in the Inland Empire was at generational lows. And another measure of the health of the regional economy can be seen in the growth of the labor force. Labor force is effectively a measure of the number of people who are both working and who are actively looking for work in a given region. And you can see that the growth of the labor force in the Inland Empire has far outpaced the growth that we've seen in California and, again, other parts of Southern California. Another way that we can gauge the strength of the Inland Empire economy is by looking at its housing market. So what we have seen is that after the hemorrhaging that was caused following the Great Recession, house prices are nearing the level that they stood at during the time of the Great Recession. The good news is that this time house prices are based on solid fundamentals, whereas leading up to the Great Recession, a lot of unwise and borrowing and lending practices were fueling house prices at that time. This time, house prices are growing for the right reasons. Another gauge of the health of the housing market can be by looking at the rental market. And what we see is that both rents have been increasing and vacancies have been decreasing in the Inland Empire, which is a sign of a healthy housing market. The commercial real estate market has been doing great also, again, off those lows which we observed during the Great Recession. Over time, the value of commercial permits has been increasing at a steady clip. And yes, they fell a touch in 2019, but the longer term trend is undeniable. Since 2010, we see the value of commercial permits trending up in the Inland Empire, which of course is a measure of the desirability of businesses to invest in physical infrastructure in the region. Typically, we see recessions caused by structural problems in the economy. This was certainly the case during the Great Recession. The way in which the current recession is differentiated from many other recessions that we see is because this is not something which was due to the recession was not due to some structural imbalance in the economy, but was due to the onset of the pandemic. So some people will refer to the recession as a mandated recession. There was some exogenous force which created the recession rather than some systematic and endemic problem with the economy itself. But now we're going to take a little look at what some of the economic fallout has been from February and March of this year. The most noticeable impact of the pandemic on the economy can be seen in the labour market. And in the months of March and April this year, we saw nearly 200,000 payroll positions shed in the Inland Empire economy. Now, we have started to see a recovery since this time, thankfully, but there is still some damage which has been sustained in the labour market. So if you would compare the number of people employed in the Inland Empire in August to the number that were employed in the Inland Empire in February, we see 130,000 fewer people employed in August than was the case in February, which is a decline of around about 8%. Now, some sectors have been hit much harder than others. So accommodation and food services have seen the disappearance of nearly 47,000 jobs, which is a contraction of around about 30% in the sector. Other sectors which have seen noticeable contractions include other services, which is a sector that includes, for example, hair and nail salons. The retail sector has been affected, and we've also seen fallout in education and healthcare as well. So the chart on the left here shows that in the months of March and April, as I mentioned, nearly 200,000 jobs were cut in the Inland Empire. And why we saw a pretty significant snapback in June, when nearly 20% of those jobs, nearly 25% I should say, of those jobs returned to the economy. The economic recovery, as viewed through the labour market, has slowed off since this time. So the months of July and August did see slower job growth. Now, under normal circumstances, adding 11 or 12,000 jobs to the Inland Empire economy in any given month would be great news, but when we have a deficit of 130,000 jobs, we would like that growth to be a little quicker. Now, obviously, what has been holding the labour market back has been the resurgence of COVID cases that peaked in late July and early August, and a lot of the restrictions that were put in place both locally and at the state level. Now, the chart on the right shows the good news, which is that the Inland Empire has performed better than California and neighbouring counties in the region. So whereas the Inland Empire economy or labour market contracted by around about 8%, that same figure in the state of California is around about 10%. Another way in which the Inland Empire has fared better than California and other members of the Southern California community is through the labour force. As I mentioned before, the labour force is a measure of all of those people who are both employed and actively looking for work. And at both the national level and in the state of California, we have seen quite a significant contraction in the labour force. So nationally, there are 5 million fewer people looking for work than was the case in February. In the state of California, that number is around about 900,000 people. And these are people who have become discouraged and stopped looking for work and have left the labour market. In the Inland Empire, we haven't seen an exodus nearly as great as that. And in fact, the labour force in the Inland Empire has remained relatively stable. With respect to the unemployment rate, again, we are coming off generational lows, but the unemployment rate in the Inland Empire is still hovering up at over around about 10%. Again, it's better than the state has been doing, but much higher than where we would like to see it. So one of the noticeable things about the performance of the labour market this year is how it's affected some workers and some categories of workers more than others. And we can look at this by looking at the sectors which have been primarily affected by the labour market fallout. So the hospitality sector, as I mentioned before, a sector which contains food and accommodation services, has seen the biggest fall in jobs following the outbreak of the pandemic. And as this slide shows, the majority of those jobs are concentrated in the restaurant sectors of the economy. Now, the pie charts on the right display the workers in the Inland Empire, or the demographics of the workers in the Inland Empire who typically work in these sectors of the economy. And what they show is that workers in the hospitality sector typically tend to be non-white, so only around about a third of the hospitality sector is made up of white workers. We can also see that the hospitality sector is disproportionately made up of young workers. So workers under the age of 25 account for around a third of all workers in the hospitality sector. And there's a slight skew towards females as well, where we see a slightly larger share of females working in the hospitality industry than we do male workers. We can see a very similar trend in the retail sector of the economy as well. Again, retail is another sector which has been hit disproportionately hard by the fallout from the pandemic. Again, in the Inland Empire, we see a very large non-white labour force. And also, again, the labour force who works in the retail industry in the Inland Empire skews young. Around about a quarter of the workers under the age of 25, and another 45% of the workers in the sector fall between the age of 25 and 44. Again, the split between male and female is pretty even in the industry. And then finally, just to further reinforce this point that the fallout from the labour market has tended to affect some workers more than it has others, we can look at the education and health services sector of the economy. Again, we see a similar story here whereby non-whites make up the majority of the workforce. The age distribution is a little less weighted to that younger cohort of workers under the age of 25, but as you can see in the bottom pie chart there, female workers make up nearly 75% of all workers in the education and healthcare sectors of the economy. So what we can see is that the sectors which have contracted the most as a result of the fallout from the spread of the virus have been sectors which predominantly there have been sectors which are predominantly worked in by non-whites, younger workers, and female workers. So it just gives you a sense of how this fallout has affected members of the society or members of the Inland Empire, residents of the Inland Empire differently. Another way that we can look at the fallout of the Inland Empire economy is just to look at business activity. In this slide here, what we're doing is measuring sales tax revenue. So this is a proxy for how much spending is taking place in the Inland Empire economy. Now, in the chart on the left of the screen here, what we can see is that by far the biggest contraction has been seen in fuel and service stations. And that makes a lot of sense, right? People are driving less, they're consuming less gas, which means they're spending less money on gas. Other notable contraction has occurred in restaurants and hotels. A number of the government restraints on business activity that were put in place did affect restaurants in a disproportionate way. Restrictions on indoor dining has meant that the capacity of restaurants has been severely constrained, which has had, of course, an impact on spending in the sector. So we've seen a big fallout which has affected consumption in different components of the economy. And this slide here tells the picture as of Q2. There are other ways that we can monitor consumption in the Inland Empire. And in this slide here, I'm showing how spending has been affected across credit card platforms. So this is data which tracks spending by people on their credit cards, and you can still see that consumption in the Inland Empire is around about 10% lower than it was entering into the pandemic. And that puts the Inland Empire pretty much in line with the state of California. And we would expect this as the labour market has contracted, and especially as some of the effects of the stimulus have worn off, and as the sort of enhanced unemployment benefits that were given to workers by the federal government expired on July 31st. What we've seen is that consumption is taking some time to recover, and it's not quite back where we would like it to be. Okay, how has the real estate market performed in the Inland Empire following the outbreak of the pandemic? Well, the great news is that the housing market has seen an extraordinary snapback. So the chart on the left shows that in Q2, year-over-year sales were down in San Bernardino and Riverside County, but using the sort of data set, or sort of that shows how far the residential real estate market had fallen in Q2, but the chart on the right shows you the extent to which the housing market has recovered since. So what we saw in June, July and August was a quite extraordinary snapback in sales growth within the Inland Empire. Another way that we can see the strength of the housing market, or the rebound in the housing market in the Inland Empire, is to look at home sales. So what we saw was that from April to August, house prices rose by 13% in Riverside County and grew by 8% in San Bernardino County. And in the chart on the right, you can see that house prices in Riverside County have exceeded their Great Recession peaks, and in San Bernardino County we're on the precipice of passing that threshold as well. So what is it that explains the strong bounce back in the residential real estate market in the Inland Empire? There are probably three reasons for this, and the first reason goes back to the discussion that we just had about the labour market. The labour market is disproportionately affecting people who wouldn't fit the typical profile of a home buyer. It's typically affecting people in the lowest paying sectors of the economy, which means that, relatively speaking, the higher income earners in the region have fared better as a result of the fallout from the pandemic. So the people who would typically buy homes have been affected the least by the pandemic. The second reason, of course, is that we have historically low interest rates. So as interest rates decrease, the cost of buying a home decreases also, which fuels activity in the residential real estate market. And a third reason is due to inventory. So currently the Inland Empire is particularly constrained in the supply of housing. And when you sort of combine these three factors together, the fact that inventories are running low, the fact that the people who would typically buy a home have been least affected by the fallout from the pandemic, and you throw in low interest rates, you're going to see upward pressure on house prices. Another feature of the fallout from the pandemic has been permits. So while home sales and home prices have rebounded nicely, what we have seen in the short term is a relative contraction in the number of permits that have been issued. Now, in Riverside County, we actually have seen year-to-date growth in the number of residential permits issued. This is year-to-date as of Q2. That was primarily driven by the issue of permits in Q1. There was a contraction in Q2, but that wasn't enough to see the strong level of permitting that was seen in that first quarter of the year. What we did see, though, in San Bernardino County was a contraction in the issuance of permits, residential single-family home permits, that is, of around about 5%. What is striking is when we look at the issuance of multifamily permits. So in Riverside County, we see a contraction of nearly 93% on a year-over-year basis. So even though the issuance of single-family permits was strong in Riverside County in Q2, the number of multifamily permits contracted by nearly 100%. In San Bernardino County, that rate is much lower at around about 40%. But again, we should consider these slides in the context of the discussion we just had about tight supply and tight inventories. The fact that we've had this contraction, particularly in multifamily permits through the first two the first two quarters of this year is going to create further constraint on supply in the region. And this chart illustrates a very similar point whereby this time we're looking at construction rather than permitting, but you can see in both San Bernardino and Riverside counties, we did see that contraction in construction in the first two quarters of this year, which again means that houses will be coming onto the market at a slower rate, and in a constrained, tightly supplied market, this is going to create upward pressure on house prices in the near term. Another gauge of the health of the real estate market can be seen in commercial permitting activity. In this slide here, we've measured commercial permitting activity by the value of the commercial permits that have been issued. And what we see is that in the first two quarters of this year, the value of the commercial permits that were issued were considerably down on the same period from a year earlier. So we see a contraction of around about $500 million worth of permits issued over this period. One of the interesting questions surrounding the commercial real estate market is the extent to which changes that have come about in working practices as a result of the pandemic might translate into change in demand for commercial real estate. So one of the most obvious areas where we might see change is with respect to the demand for office space. Over the last 6 months, a number of workers, those who have the ability to work remotely, have been working from home. Now, we've been hearing for 40 years about the trend towards telecommuting and what impact it's going to have on the geography of where people live. And for the most part, these stories over a period of time have been overblown. And the big question is are things going to change this time? Has this grand experiment which we've undertaken going to lead to this practice whereby many more people are working from home on a permanent basis? And if that is the case, that could affect the demand for office space. Now, our base case is that workers, once it is safe to do so, and hopefully in the near term, if the pandemic is behind us, many workers will be returning to the office. The retail sector is a different question. Obviously, we've seen secular changes over the last 20 years with the rise in e-commerce. Now, that trend has been accelerated over the last 6 months as more people have been purchasing goods online than would normally be the case. So the retail real estate market, which has been under significant pressure for the last 10 years or so, we can expect that trend to continue if sort of a more amplified shift to e-commerce endures once the pandemic is behind us. Okay, so where does this leave us? Now, the purpose of this presentation has been to point out that prior to the outbreak of the pandemic, the structural balance of the Inland Empire economy was sound. Again, this was not a recession that was caused by some exuberance or some endemic or systemic problem that we had with the economy, either nationally, in California, or in the Inland Empire. And that gives us hope that the bounce back from the recession is going to be much quicker than we've seen in most other recessions. We have seen a strong bounce back in the residential real estate market, and to a lesser extent in consumption also. For as long as interest rates stay as low as they are, and for as long as we see constrained supply, this will continue to put upward pressure on house prices in the Inland Empire. With respect to consumption, consumption activity is ultimately going to be tied to the health of the labour market. The quicker we can get everybody back working to the level that they were prior to the pandemic, back where we were in February, the quicker we'll see the recovery in consumption. One slight dark cloud relates to the labour market. While we did see a strong bounce back in June, we have seen the growth of jobs again throughout the economy, whether that's nationally in California or the Inland Empire, slow since this time. So we've dug ourselves sort of halfway out of the hole, but there's still some ways to go before we can get back just to the level that we were in February of this year. Now, most economists will tell you that employment is a lagging variable, and that as other aspects of the economy improve, we should expect to see employment follow in sync. But that is, of course, no help to the people who have been disproportionately affected by the fallout from the labour market. So as we saw, this labour market fallout has predominantly affected non-white workers, lower income workers generally, and women and younger members of the workforce also. Now, we should not expect to see a full recovery of the labour market until sometime in 2022. Again, in the Inland Empire, we have a deficit of around about 130,000 jobs right now. We added 12,000 jobs in the most recent month. At that pace, it would take another 10 months from now, which would take us out to around about August of next year, just to return to where we were in February of this year. So the recovery in the labour market isn't going to be as quick as we might like. With respect to the commercial real estate market, again, we just spoke about this, but the big questions relate to whether there is going to be some sort of structural shift in the demand for commercial real estate. And as we suspect, the bigger impact is likely to be on retail real estate. Anyway, with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I look forward to answering any questions you have during the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Osman, as well as brilliant. Appreciate all the great points you made as well. But there's a lot of questions, and I want to try to get to them as quickly as possible. And at this point now, both Christopher and Tanner are joining me to answer these questions from the audience. And so let's just jump right into them, if you don't mind. And this first question, I'm reading from Mr. John Levy. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And has the university looked at U.S. performance on the pandemic relative to the rest of the world? As I look, the U.S. is about 5 times worse than the average per capita of the rest of the world, even worse for more affluent countries. But we have a bigger post-pandemic problem because of this mismanagement. Whichever one of you two that'd like to take that on.
Yeah, that is absolutely a tough one, no doubt about it. To be honest with you, you know, we really been focusing largely on the economy. Now, I think when you get into the data, you have to appreciate that relative to a lot of other countries, we've already experienced significantly more cases, significantly more deaths. Indeed, while the U.S. only has 5 or 6% of the global population, we are somewhere close to the 20% range in terms of cases. So, no, we have not managed things as well up till now. However, I would also note that we are still figuring out this disease, how it works, how it operates, what is successful and not successful at combating it. And it's worth noting that overall, like Europe, for example, which had very aggressive efforts up front to control the virus, are actually seeing an enormous resurgence. The UK, for example, has a substantially more new cases per million people in the United States right now in their second round of this. And of course, you look at a place like Sweden, which didn't close their economy and yet has significantly fewer cases overall. And yet again, they don't seem to be having anywhere near the problem we are. It's a complex conversation. It's a complex question. I appreciate the highly political nature of it. And what I'll tell you is this. We got a long ways to go to kind of unpack everything that's happened, and then we can start really having this conversation in a more substantive way.
Thank you for that, Chris. Tanya, you want to take a shot at that, or should we move on?
I think we should move on to the next question.
All right, the next one is from Zach Seal. He states here, what about spending behaviors that will remain after a vaccine is available? For example, working remotely, which could mean lower office leases, and for example, shopping online which would also mean lower retail lease rates. Any thoughts on that?
Tanner, why don't you go ahead?
Sure. I think that, the retail sector, we've seen a secular trend that has long predated the pandemic. And I think one of the important questions that we have is the extent to which we've sort of amplified longer term trends. If you look at the increase in e-commerce and online retail sales, we're around about 16 or 17% of all retail sales now occur online, which is about I'd say an increase of about 30% compared to pre-pandemic levels. So yeah, that is one of the sort of open questions is what impact is this going to have on retail real estate? I think, again, we should probably look at this in the context of a long-term secular trend. Over years, we have had regional markets which have been oversupplied. And, as we move into a world where that share of e-commerce takes up a larger chunk of the total, we're going to see further pressure on the retail real estate market.
Now, this next question comes from Michael Samardziha. I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly, but the question here is, the assumption is that the virus will continue being as virulent as it has been. What happens to the forecast if the second wave is much worse than the first, and maybe meaning even a third wave, as opposed to the second one that we recently had in the summer?
Yeah, I'll grab that quick. No, actually, so there obviously has been this, again, speaking of politically charged terms, this idea of herd immunity out there. And in fact, the WHO released a report today saying that even conversations about herd immunity are unethical and so on and so forth. But before we go into that realm, I think what's really important here in terms of this conversation is recognizing that in general, the more people who have been exposed or have some innate resistance to this disease, the harder it is to spread through the population. Now, the end result of that is eventually, if you get enough people with it, you will indeed have herd immunity, in which case the disease is no longer a threat at all. When you look, say, here in the United States at the second surge we saw over the summer, and of course, a little bit of the third surge that we're seeing right now, what you are seeing is not, if you will, new waves of the virus, because it's not really going into places it's already been. For example, New Jersey, New York, places that were very, very hard hit at the beginning of this. The number of new cases there is substantially down from where it's been. And it seems as if that disease is going to be easy to control there now. The new surge in cases we're seeing in the United States is it's getting into populations it just hasn't been yet. We're talking about Wisconsin, the Dakotas, Montana, the Midwest is seeing it. The second surge, of course, was Texas, Arizona, Florida. California has kind of been across all of these zones. So in a sense, it seems as if you just have to have a certain proportion of the population exposed to this at some level, and then you can bring it under control again. This would suggest that no, we are not lining up for a massive second or third wave of the disease. Quite the contrary, it would suggest that as long as we continue to do what we're doing, protecting those who need to be protected, working hard, washing our hands, wearing our masks, that eventually this thing will kind of burn itself out, not unlike how we deal with wildfires. And as such, we don't even necessarily need a vaccine to get close to full recovery. We just have to continue to do the things that they've been telling us to do all along. Wear your mask, wash your hands, practice social distancing, be careful, and we can manage to get this thing under control.
Thank you for that. Now, Nate Kelly is enjoying this analysis. Any concerns about the drop in labor force participation weighing on growth moving forward?
Well, it's interesting. Labor shortages has been an ongoing problem in both California and the U.S. over the last few years. That's been a centerpiece of our forecast. The idea that a desperate shortage of workers is holding up the economy, but of course, it's also contributing to good wage gains we're seeing within our economy over the course of the last couple of years. Obviously, the short run dynamics, when you think about the lack of job opportunities, there already has been a modest drop in participation rates. But remember, while we acknowledge that this thing is going to continue into next year, our date of, if you will, close to full recovery is substantially quicker than most other folks out there. The data up till now has really, I think, supported that particular position. The resilience we've seen in the U.S. economy and the California economy already is suggestive that we're going to be up and running rapidly. And of course, we're going to get back into tight labor market and labor shortage problems, which will in turn start to bring people back into the labor force. Ultimately, it's a demographic conversation, not a participation rate conversation. And there's no doubt from a demographic standpoint, it would really help both California to have a better housing policy and the United States overall have a better immigration policy in order to deal with these long-run issues.
Thank you for that. Now, Martin Gellin is stating here, giving your analysis of where we are going, what is your forecast for 2021 in terms of employment, personal income, and GDP? And
can you ask him quick if he wants that down to the 15th decimal place or the 16th decimal place? Look, as noted, we're lining up for a 36% growth rate in the third quarter. Unemployment's going to be well below 7% by the end of the year. And we're looking for something close to full recovery by the middle of next year and back on track by the end of next year. In terms of the specific quarter-to-quarter numbers, I'll leave it to you guys to go ahead and download our latest forecast and take a look through the numbers.
Speaking about housing, Diana Ranhel, I hope I said that correctly, and maybe this is for Dr. Osmond. Are more people moving into the IE area causing housing shortage, or no new housing has been built over time to sustain normal growth?
So in a short-term response to the pandemic, I think it's very difficult to get a read on what is happening in real time. These are trends which sort of play out over a number of quarters. I think that a lot of headlines have surrounded real estate markets in places like New York City and San Francisco. If you're to sort of believe the story that there's going to be a mass exodus from cities, then yeah, you would find places like the Inland Empire seeing some spillover. But I think at this point, it's way too early to detect any such trend in the data. And our base case is that the pandemic is not going to lead to the sort of end of New York City and San Francisco. Big cities have been around for 200 years. They're going to be here to stay. At the margins, it could be the case that there's going to be some extra suburban growth, but right now it's just too soon for us to say.
Okay, and going back to your K-shaped recovery, this is a question by Valerie Backus. What is the income cap for the descending end of the K, and what is the income bottom for the ascending end of the K?
That's another one of those, how many decimal points do you want sort of questions. Look, when you discuss the idea of the K-shaped recovery, what it suggests obviously is that those at the lower end of the skill distribution, let's talk about skills for the most part, have obviously seen their job situation suffer more. Consider the industries that have been hit hard. You're talking about recreation, you're talking about tourism, you're talking about personal services, restaurants, hotels. These are sectors that we hire a lot of low-skilled folks, and those folks are definitely suffering right now. We really do need to see an expansion of the federal unemployment extension that they had in place to help these folks out. With that in mind, the unemployment rate for those who are at that low end of the skill distribution has also been falling significantly faster than for the upper end. And we know overall that, say, for example, you look at just the restrictions still in the place here in California that are preventing a lot of these industries, a lot of these companies from reopening. Their fortunes are going to be best helped when we actually reopen things, right? When we go ahead and say it's okay to have your restaurant at 50% capacity. We need to be thinking about that rather than trying to figure out where the line is in the sand, because there's plenty of high-end workers who are having a tough time as well, and plenty of low-end workers who still have their job and are making good money. It's very much a bifurcated recovery. Some folks are not doing well and some folks are. And let's focus on getting the economy reopened.
Well, thank you both for your responses and for your presentations. I'm afraid, folks, that the time for questions have passed. We are now near the noon hour, but I definitely want to thank our sponsors, as well as the UCR School of Business Center for Economic Forecasting and Development. And just an important reminder to everybody that you'll be receiving both a link to the digital conference forecast book and a brief electronic survey about the conference. And those will be delivered to the email you shared when registering. Please take a moment to respond to the survey. It only takes a few minutes, and these evaluations are critical in helping us improve our future events. And with that being said, it's 12 o'clock on the hour. Thank you again for attending, and appreciate, obviously, Dr. Thornburg as well as Dr. Osmond for your presentations.